Perfect. So we are now live, and good evening, everyone who is watching us on Karwaan. This is Ishan Sharma, and with me today, I have a very special guest who is an icon, a legend, and we all know her, Professor Wendy Doniger. Professor Doniger doesn't need a formal introduction. We all know her, we all know her work. She is currently a distinguished service professor emerita of the history of religions, professor in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at University of Chicago. Professor Doniger's research and teaching interests revolve around two basic areas: Hinduism and mythology. Her courses in mythology address themes in cross cultural expenses such as death, dreams, evil, horses, जिसके बारे में आज हम बात करेंगे, the topic that we are going to talk about today, sex and women. Her courses in Hinduism cover a broad spectrum that, in addition to mythology, considers literature, law, gender, and zoology. So, without further ado, considering the fact that you are here to listen to the professor and not me, I'll formally invite Professor Doniger to take over the stage and start with the presentation. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation. Truly an honor.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I think it's wonderful that you students have organized this program, and I'm honored to be in it and to follow in the footsteps of Yashaswini Chandra, another woman who writes about horses, and the great historian Romila Thapar. So I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm going to give a talk that comes from the book about horses that is going to come out in India in a couple of weeks from Speaking Tigers, called Winged Stallions and Wicked Mares: Horses in Indian Myth and History. So the particular topic I want to talk about today is the role of horses in the assimilation of foreigners in the history of India. And I want to begin with Arabian horses in South Asian history. Most of the people who entered India over the centuries rode in on horseback. First came the Vedic people, formerly known as Indo-Europeans, more properly speaking, Indo-European speakers, who brought their horses with them from we know not where, although it is greatly contested, probably the Caucasus. Then the Greeks and Scythians riding over the northwest passes. Turks and Mongols, the latter to become known in India as the Mughals, brought Arabian horses from Central Asia and Persian, overland and by sea. Then came the British, who brought Cape horses from South Africa, and whalers from New South Wales and Australia. And most of these people came peacefully as traders or migrants, but some came to conquer. And it was largely because they had horses, or better horses, or more horses, or bigger horses, or all of the above, that the invaders were able to overpower the South Asian people who did not have such horses. But the land of South Asia did not welcome horses. It is not easy for horses to find good grazing land in South Asia. They're not well adapted to conditions in most of the area most of the time. Horses hate the humid heat of the Indian plains, and during the monsoon rains, their hooves soften in the wet soil and pieces break off, causing painful recurring sores. The violent contrast between the monsoon and the hot season makes the soil ricochet between swampy in one season and hard, parched, and cracked in another. And I'm going to try to show you a picture. There we go. This is a picture from Karnataka of an emaciated horse and an emaciated rider. Can you see it okay, Ishan? Going
Yes,
through?
ma'am. Yeah.
Good. Horses do thrive in parts of South Asia, particularly in the northwest part of the South Asian subcontinent. There, for many centuries, many of the best horses in India were bred. Some of the Maharashtrian breeders whom I consulted in 1996 complained that at partition, Pakistan got the best grazing land, a statement that has a lot of truth in it, as well as resentment. But because horses did not thrive in most of India, there was an extensive and well-documented trade in the importing of horses throughout Indian history, particularly from Western and Central Asia, through what was then the Northwest Territory. I think I'll go back to me for a while. Okay, so now that's okay. Turkish and Arabian merchants and storytellers and seekers and mercenary soldiers brought Arabian horses to South Asia from early in the Common Era, both by sea and over the Northwest Passages. In subsequent centuries, the horse trade continued to bring Arabians, that is to say both human Arabians and equine, to India. Other groups also rode in on horseback, now including conquerors, most notably the Turkic peoples of the Delhi Sultanate and the Central Asian Mongols who became the Mughals. Indians tended to call all of these political groups, including Persians, many of whom had entered India centuries before the Arabs, Mughals, and Turks, they called them all Turks, Turkey. And they usually called their horses Arabians, even when they were really Turkish or Persian. In fact, one of the great qualities of Arabian horses is what breeders call prepotency, that is to say, the ability to transmit their characteristics to their offspring. And so each Arabian horse may have had a disproportionate influence on other breeds, so that those Turkish or Persian horses may indeed have been to a significant degree Arabian. Now I'm going to do this again, and I'm going to do this. There we go. That's Jahangir on a white horse playing polo. It's likely that Persian horses were imported into South Asia from an early period about 600 CE, but the increased demand for Persian and Arabian horses first arose from the perceived threat posed by Arab cavalry sometime after the conquest of Sind by the Arabs in 712 CE. Centuries later, when these foreign dynasties had been established, a steady stream of Central Asian imports was still seemingly vital to the virility of both Muslim and Hindu rule. The Deccan sultans and their opposite numbers, the martial Hindu kings of Maharashtra, Rajasthan, and Vijayanagar, imported Arabian horses on large scale in order to improve the breed of cavalry horses in their own districts. So now we'll go. There we go. This is a painting of Chand Bibi out walking on a horse. Horses not only affected the practical relationship between Indians and the people they generally called Turks, but also functioned in art and literature as a symbolic gauge of shifting attitudes within these relationships. Many Hindu rituals and myths involving Arabian horses and or Muslim riders arose at this time. Despite or because of the political domination of the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, the Indian stories from this period generally depict both Arabian horses and their Muslim riders in a favorable light. For Muslims had lived in India for many centuries by the time these stories were composed and were no longer always associated with dominant political groups. And many Hindus welcomed Muslims as the bearers of the gift of horses. This is Baz Bahadur and Rupmati, a painting from Kulo. Arabian horse lore strongly influenced Indian horse lore. And there are many Indian stories about heroic Turkish, which is to say Persian or Arabian, horses and horsemen. One of the most interesting examples of a Muslim equine hero in Indian folklore is Muttul Ravutan, who was worshipped in Hindu temples in the southern districts of Tamil Nadu. The name Muttul Ravutan derives its second element, Ravutan, from a term meaning a Muslim cavalier or horseman or trooper. The term clearly evokes its common and traditional association of the Muslim warrior on horseback, a Sufi warrior leading his band of followers, or the leader of an imperial army of conquest. Hindu worshippers make vegetarian offerings to an image of Muttul Ravutan as a Ravutan, a horse rider, sculpted in relief on a stone plaque. Sometimes Muttul Ravutan rides the horse within his temple. Often a clay horse or horses await him outside the shrine. The horse is canonically white and is said to be able to fly through the air. At Chinnasalam, Muttul Ravutan receives marijuana opium and cigars for himself, and horsegram, kolu, for his horse. His religious affiliations are complex indeed. He is both Rajputized and Afghanized. At one temple, he may be Mutala Raja, at another, Muhammadan Khan. The medieval Rajput epics, I think I'll stop this here, were nurtured by a culture that combined Afghan and Rajput traditions and much more. The long struggle and eventual fall of the Rajput kingdoms under the onslaught of Sultanate and Mughal armies gave rise to a genre of regional vernacular epics that evolved out of oral narratives in this period, taking up themes from the Sanskrit epic of the Mahabharata and also the Ramayana, but transforming them by infusing them with a new egalitarian or pluralist theme, such as the figure of the hero's Muslim companion. The irony is that Islamic culture contributed greatly to these grand heroic poems composed in response to what the authors perceived as the fall of a great Hindu civilization at the hand of Muslims. Muslims in India and Pakistan also maintain many of their own equine myths and rituals. One of the most popular of these is the ritual of the horse of Karbala. Each year during the first month in the Islamic calendar, but particularly on the 10th day known as the Day of Ashura, Shia Muslim communities in India and Pakistan, as elsewhere in the Muslim world, celebrate the festival of Muharram. At this time, they mourn the Imam Hussein, the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, who was martyred in a battle in 680 CE in Karbala in the Iraqi desert. Central to this celebration is Hussein's battle stallion, Zulyena, or Du al-Jannah in Arabic, the winged one, the horse of Karbala, who is said to have returned wounded and riderless after Hussein was killed. The horse is sometimes called the Burak of Karbala, after the winged horse said to have carried Muhammad to heaven. In some villages in Bihar during this celebration, a horseshoe said to come from Zulena is carried to all the Sufi tombs in the village, touching each tomb. Elsewhere in India and Pakistan, wherever there are significant Muslim populations, a horse representing the horse of Karbala is decorated and led riderless through the streets. The horse's mane and flanks are streaked with red paint to represent his wounds, and his mane, colored red, is said to be stained with Hussein's blood. Worshippers make images of the horse riderless, pierced by arrows, his chest streaming blood. The idea of the suffering horse, the compassionate horse who weeps for his dead or absent master, is well known in India from stories about Kantaka, the horse who shed tears at parting from the future Buddha. This is another story. The tears shed by the horse of Karbala express the belief that the horse is compassionate for his wounded or dead rider. And now I'm going to share another image, and it will be, there we go. Khandoba. Many Indian equine myths and rituals involve both Hindus and Muslims. Hindus as well as Muslims worship at the shrines of Muslim horse saints such as Alam Saeed of Baroda, known as Gore Kapir, the horse saint. His horse was buried near him, and Hindus hang images of the animal on trees round his tomb. In Bengal, Hindus offer clay horses to deified Muslim saints like Satyapir. Khandoba is an important god among both Hindus and Muslims in Maharashtra. The Emperor Aurangzeb, who is said to have been forced to flee from Khandoba's power, that is to say, from Marathi armies, is also said to have given Khandoba the name of Mallu Khan or Ajmat Khan, by which some people still call him. The Muslim equestrians of Maharashtra are often followers of Khandoba. Yet Khandoba is an equestrian manifestation of the Hindu god Shiva. A Muslim leads the horse in the Khandoba festival in Maharashtra, and a Muslim family traditionally keeps the horse of the god in Jejuri, an important center of Khandoba's worship. During the festival of Dussehra in Karnataka and at the Somvati Amavasya festival in Jejuri, devotees possessed by the power of Khandoba gallop like horses, whipping themselves with horsewhips, running like horses in front of the palanquin. Shiva, as Khandoba, together with other gods on horses, is depicted as a horseman throughout Maharashtra, in temples, as well as in family shrines, in houses, sometimes on silver plaques. Murals on temples and old glass paintings often depict the myth of the battle of the god, always on horseback, against the anti-gods. The story assimilates demonic horses to the Muslim enemies of the Marathi warriors. But even here, the horse of the enemy, the demon, the conqueror, becomes the horse of the hero, the Indian, the Hindu worshiper. This is a Mughal painting of the birth of the Ashwins. There's a stallion on the right and the mare on the left. One strong hint that much of medieval Indian horse law comes from Arabs is the gender of the horses. Arab horsemen and Turks and Mongols generally rode mares, regarding them as more intelligent, sensitive, and above all, loyal and affectionate than stallions. They told stories about Muhammad's magic horse, Burak, often said to be a mare and to have a woman's face. And also they told about Muhammad's 5 faithful foundation mares. One argument for the Arab preference for mares was that in raids that required silence, mares would be less inclined than stallions to whinny and give away the position of the riders, particularly if the enemy, with malicious intent, happened to bring along 1 or 2 mares in heat. This would, of course, apply equally well to Indian cavalries, but their practical concerns were apparently overridden by the mythology of the early Sanskrit texts, the Vedas and epics and Puranas, which are all about stallions, with their positive symbolism kept entire: virility, fertility, aggressive volatility. These Sanskrit texts code the female of the species, the mares, as evil, as wild animals never really tamed, the familiars of wild, sexually voracious women who deceive their husbands and abandon their children. And so Indians before the Sultanate generally preferred stallions. But in opposition to the enduring anti-mare bias and also the misogyny of the Sanskrit texts, a dramatic change takes place in the vernacular Indian equestrian epics. The heroes of the medieval epics all ride highly cooperative magic mares. And where the stallions of the earlier tradition were usually white, the mares are often black. Clearly, the authors of these stories are either ignorant of the Vedic and Puranic bias against mares, which seems very unlikely, or they chose to ignore it in favor of an imported Arabic pro-mare tradition. Here we encounter a narrative pattern of considerable detail, repeated in many different stories, suggesting that once the tradition of good mares took root, it was diffused throughout this area, rather than arising independently everywhere where people rode mares. Which takes us to Pabuji. Pabuji was a minor Rajput chief of the 14th century, subsequently deified by the local people. His story is often illustrated in Rajasthan on 20-foot-long scroll paintings called pars. Here's an example of one. There's even a contemporary version of it available on YouTube. The story begins with when an old lady named Devilbai traveled to the far shore of the 7 seas, bringing back horses of great price, including the mare Kesar Kauni. That is, the mare was imported like the expensive horses cherished by Indians throughout history. She gives the mare to Prabhuji, who rides the mare to various victories, including a horse race. The other horses raced, their hooves beating on the earth. Kesar Kalmi shone in the sky. And finally, Prabhuji is eventually killed. Stories of Hindu equestrian heroes often depict them in complex relationships with Muslims. The hero called Teja or Tej Singh or Des Singh in North India, Tesinku or Desingu Raja in South India, rides several great horses, one of which is a mare named Leela. The many stories about Teja are loosely based upon a historical figure, a Raja, the son of the commander of the fort of Senji, called Ginji in the stories, in the reign of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. The story goes that when Tej refused to obey a summons from the Nawab of Arcot, the deputy of Aurangzeb, the Nawab waged war against him, in the course of which Tej rode his horse at the head of the Nawab's elephant. The horse reared and drummed his hooves on the forehead of the elephant, blunting the Mughal advance. A soldier sliced the hocks of Tej's horse, unseating Tej, who died in the battle, as did his best friend, the Muslim Mahabat Khan. The story of Tej's horse and the elephant found its way into a suspiciously similar legend, this one about the Battle of Haldigati in 1576, in which Chetak, a gray stallion, is said to have reared up and drummed his hooves on the forehead of the war elephant of the Mughal imperial commander, helping his rider, Rana Pratap, the last Rajput to succumb to the Mughals, to kill the elephant's driver. Even with one of his hind legs hacked off above the hoof, Chetak carried Rana Pratap away to safety. The horse's name has been immortalized in a line of Chetak motor scooters produced by India's Bajaj Auto Limited. In Tamil and Telugu legend, Tesinku was a devout Vaishnava, and his best friend was a Muslim. Tej Desingu was also celebrated in fable for conquering a celestial horse, Barasari, that a fakir, a Muslim holy man, presented to the Mughal emperor, but that no one but Desingu was able to ride. Then the Nawab attacked the Senji fort. Desingu sent for his friend Mahabub Khan, who mounted his famous steed Nilavani and came to the battle. Mahabub was killed and his horse reached Desingu's side. Mahabub Khan's noble horse no longer wanted to live, and out of compassion, Desingu killed Mahabub's horse. Then he fought until they cut the legs of his horse under him. Not wishing to live after his friend and the horse had fallen, he killed himself, hurling his sword into the air and letting it fall on his chest. Stories of horses are not many in South India, but the names Barasari and Nilavani, the horses of Desingu Raja and his comrade Mahabub, are household words still today in any part of Tamil Nadu. Which brings us to horses in Northwest India under the British. This is a painting of William Moorcroft on the road to Lake Mansarovar. Moorcroft is down on the yaks on the left-hand side, and his guides are on the horses on the right. Horse trading, horse breeding, and spying combined in the British presence in Northwest India. In 1819, the British sent a man named William Moorcroft in this picture to Northwest India, Tibet, and Afghanistan on a quixotic search for suitable cavalry mounts. Moorcroft had seen mares from Kutch that he thought might be suitable for the army, and he was granted official permission to proceed towards the northwestern parts of Asia for the purpose of there procuring by commercial intercourse horses to improve the breed within the British province or for military use. But he collected information not only on horses, but also on political and economic conditions at the borders of the empire. And shortly before his mysterious final disappearance, he was briefly imprisoned in the Hindu Kush on suspicion of being a spy. Moorcroft was lost, presumed dead in August of 1825. Clearly, horses were deeply implicated in the clandestine as well as the official British subjugation of India. This is a painting of the British in camp. British soldiers stationed in India and elsewhere in what they called the Orient often went on what was euphemistically called shooting leave. That is official time off to go hunting, shooting things like tigers, but in reality, to go spying, sometimes shooting things like human beings. Horse trading was often a part of these enterprises, sometimes just a cover, sometimes a secondary objective. In 1830, when the British decided to chart the Indus River as a possible line of advance for the British to take over Sindh, Lahore, and the Punjab, Alexander Burnes led the expedition under the pretext of shipping 4 enormous dray horses, or in another version of the story, a coach and 5 enormous horses, upriver to Lahore as a gift from King William IV of England to the Maharaja Ranjit Singh, ruler of the Punjab. In another exploit of this sort, when Charles Stuart called on the Persian governor at Mohammadabad, he told him he was Khwaja Ibrahim of Calcutta and that he had come to buy horses for the Bombay market. He had to lend credence to his role as a horse dealer by actually buying occasional horses from the governor. He was sometimes overcharged, but reckoned it was worth the money to avert suspicion and keep his channels open. Which brings us to M.F. Hussain. The artist M.F. Hussain, who was born in Bombay in 1919 and died in London in 2011, was widely regarded as India's greatest contemporary artist. But he was harassed by lawsuits and warrants for his arrest and threats against his life because of his portraits of nude Hindu goddesses, as well as for paintings with political messages critical of the Indian government, and because he was a Muslim. He was accused of, quote, advocating the coupling of Hindu goddesses with beasts of the field, unquote, an image familiar from the ancient Vedic horse sacrifice. After his paintings were ripped apart and his apartment in Bombay bombed, he died in self-imposed exile in London. Hussain included horses in his paintings for many years, but perhaps his greatest horse painting was Lightning, which is depicted here, a mural depicting 10 horses that he painted in 1975, inspired by the emergency in which Prime Minister Indira Gandhi trampled into the dust human rights in India. Lightning consists of 12 panels, each 10 feet high and 5 feet wide, the largest work Hussain ever made. Here's a detail. It's perhaps significant that the name of the winged horse that carried Muhammad from Mecca to Jerusalem and up to heaven and back was Burak, derived from the Arabic word for lightning. The horses, naked of any saddlery in Hussein's painting, are bucking and kicking and rearing and plunging, their mouths open, expressing the war of rider against horse, horse against horse. And it took a Muslim painter, the inheritor of the great tradition of Muslim paintings of horses, to create this realization of the moment of lightning when the Indian state was on the verge of collapse. Throughout Indian history, horses have belonged only to people who are not merely economically other than the Indian villagers, but politically and often religiously other. Any Indian equine tradition is likely to reflect the influence of the many foreigners who brought horses into India. The first waves of these foreigners established the first patterns of Indian horse myths and horse rituals, patterns that we may still detect in contemporary folklore. But the themes are not merely repeated or parroted, they're changed, challenged. The fact that they often appear in inversion or even perhaps in subversion may suggest a submerged, perhaps even repressed resistance against the imported equestrian forms. Though these foreign equestrians are often of low or no social status in the caste system, they had to have had superior political or economic or military powers to be able to afford the cost of maintaining horses in India. The horse represented this power, the power of the sorts of people that make other people want to tell them to get down off your high horse. The punitive military expedition rode into the village on horseback, trampling the crops. The tax collector rode into the village and took away 9/10 of the year's harvest, leaving the villagers to near starvation. Policemen and petty officials were mounted and everyone else was not. Materially, the horses and their owners were the enemies of most Indian villagers. There's still a Hindi saying that advises you, stay away from the fore of an officer and the aft of a horse. It was as wise to avoid those people as to keep out of the range of those back hooves. Tribal mythologies in India speak of horses trampling to death the first humans created by the gods. And over the centuries, as in this picture, Indian artists depicted horses trampling on people. No wonder that horses were demonized and treated cruelly in some of the texts created by Indians who did not have horses. Horses remain kshatriya animals with all the negative connotations of that class: power, domination, extortion, death. To which was sometimes added another factor: some of these equestrian kshatriyas were not Hindus but Muslims. The Indo-Persian poet Amir Khusrau, who lived from about 1253 to 1325, spoke of the forces of Alauddin Khalji destroying the Shiva Linga in the Nataraja temple in Chidambaram as the kick of the horse of Islam. The Hindu poet Vidyapati in the early 15th century included horses in a damning condemnation of Turks in this short poem. The Turks coerce passersby by doing forced labor. Grabbing hold of a Brahmin boy, they put a cow's vagina on his head. They rub out his tilak and break his sacred thread. They want to ride on horses. They use rice to make liquor. They destroy temples and construct mosques. So in this poem, they want to ride horses is apparently a sin tantamount to destroying temples. And here's another painting of a horseman trampling on a foot soldier. Let's bring this up a little bit there. This is from Madhya Pradesh in the 17th century. In the 17th century, a Hindu from Afghanistan insisted that when he died, he wanted to be buried where he couldn't hear the hoof steps of Mughal horses. And in the 19th century, the British preference for Muslims, in part because the Muslims were better horsemen than the Hindus, generated great resentment. One 19th century story depicts the wicked Cobra King Tatig the Naga reading the books of the wisdom of the Quran. But as we have seen, Muslim ideas and Muslims often played a positive role in the lore of horses in India. The equine mythology of India reveals a surprisingly affirmative attitude to the many foreign equestrian rulers of India. And here, my final image is a painting of a famous painter in Rajasthan painting horses on the walls of his house. In many myths, magical horses come down to earth from heaven. This is an old theme in world mythology, and in India, it's reflected in the pervasive notion of the horse as a semi-divine creature, enriched by the historical memory of horses coming down from the northern mountain passes, as close to heaven as anyone could imagine. In the story of Desingu, the horse comes from the sky, but also from the Muslims. These Muslims are the enemies of the ruler. They kill Desingu, but they are also the source of the magic horses. There are even more stories about magical horses that come from the waters, the old myth compounded by the historical experience of the importation of horses from the sea. A story about horses from the sea was told from time to time about Kutch on the Arabian Sea in Gujarat. Kutch is where Abul Fazl, the Mughal historian, said the best horses in India were bred, and where Moorcroft, the Englishman, had seen mares that he thought might be suitable for the British Army. But it's on the question of the importing of horses into Kutch that the mythology takes over in a narrative about the Sangars, mixed Hindu and Muslim cattlemen who lived on the north shore of the Gulf of Kutch. One story is that in the 8th century, King Punvar oppressing the Sangars, they sought the aid of some foreigners from Western Asia. 72 horsemen came, and establishing themselves on a hill 3 miles from the city, took the fort and killed the chief. In their honor, the Sangars made images of the 72 horsemen, set them on a railed platform in the city with their faces toward the south, and instituted a fair on the second Monday of Bhadrapad in September and October. This fair, lasting 2 days, is attended by about 16,000 pilgrims, mostly Kutch Hindus. Throughout the 20th century, villagers in Kutch continued to make statues of the 72 men and 1 woman mounted on horses and to offer sweet rice to the horsemen and ask them for boons. The incident at the horse of this story allegedly took place in 985 CE when a rider named Punvarao, when a ruler named Punvarao had built the stronghold of the city and then is said to have cut off the hands of his chief architect to prevent that great artist from doing similar work for another prince. Soon after that, the legend continues, 7 Sangars who worshiped the god Jak came to Kutch from Byzantium. They offended Punvaro. There are several different versions of exactly what it is that they did to offend him, who imprisoned and tortured them. They prayed to their god Jak, who came from Byzantium with 71 brothers and a sister. They killed Punvaro and destroyed the city. The story, still retold in Kutch in the 20th century, sometimes adds that white-skinned horse-riding foreigners from Central Asia were the ones who came and freed the Sangars from Punvara. Other versions of the story say that the 72 riders, including 1 woman, came from the sea, and that after the riders saved the local villagers from the depredations of a demon, their horses were sent to Delhi, and on the way fertilized the local mares, or, according to yet another variant, the riders blessed childless women, including the queen, with children. So the story is retold, but there are patterns of the retellings. Most versions of this myth emphasize the skin color of the foreigners. They were white-skinned foreigners said to have come in the 13th century from Anatolia and Syria, or white-skinned horse-riding foreigners from Central Asia, or Greeks, Romans, Scythians, or white Huns, tall and of fair complexion, blue or gray-eyed. Thus, different variants of the equestrian myth cast different actors as the native villain and the foreign heroes. As the nature of the foreigners changes, so does the nature of the tyrant. The myth that depicts benevolent foreigners bringing horses into India also underlies an older myth about Kutch, recorded by Abul Fazl, who wrote, "It is said that a long time ago, an Arab cargo ship was wrecked and driven to the shore of Kutch, and that it had 7 choice horses, from which, according to the general belief, the breed of that country originated," end quote. This myth, which also bears a suspicious resemblance to the versions of the Punvaro story, in which the foreign saviors, sometimes said to number 7, with or without horses, are wrecked on the shore of Kutch, was then adapted into a tradition that the Arab horses swam ashore and fertilized Marwari mares, or were taken to the Marwar district and used as foundation bloodstock for the Marwari horses. So I come to my conclusion on Muslims and horses in India. The corpus of myths that depicts foreigners bringing horses into India seems to have assimilated the historical experience of the importation of horses, not only to the lingering vestiges, the cultural hoofprints, as it were, of Vedic horse myths, which are all about horses trampling on serpents, the serpents being the natives, the horses being the Indo-Aryans, but also to the more widespread theme of magical horses brought from heaven or the watery underworld, which is found in all parts of the world where there are horses. The Vedic horsemen are replaced by Arabs or Anatolians, or by implication, the British, while the Dasyus or Vedic others are replaced by a demon or a tyrant. This plasticity kept the myth alive in widely varying contexts, which expressed in very different ways the ambivalent connection between horses and foreigners. The Vedic bias is maintained. The foreign horsemen, whoever they are the heroes. In all instances, the foreigners ride to the rescue of the natives, like the American cavalry arriving in old Hollywood movies to save the women and children from people usually called Indians. But with such different actors playing the roles, the Vedic horsemen replaced by Arab horsemen, their enemies, the Dasyus, by a Pathan tyrant, is it really the same myth at all? I think it is, but another historian of religions might not. The confusion of the villains and the heroes in the story of Punvaro is no accident. The myth is rife with obfuscation. Certainly it is a myth about, and probably by, foreigners to India, a myth that manipulates the native symbolism of horses in such a way as to make the foreigners the heroes, the natives the villains, in a myth that then took root within the folklore of the natives. It's all done with mirrors, which is to say, with myths. We must take into account of the people who constructed this myth, who perpetuated it, recorded it, translated it, and selected it. The popular legends concerning the horses of Kutch were first collected on the spot by a British major in 1826. They were embodied in the Gazetteer of the Bombay Presidency in 1880 and copied with minor variations by several people. It's not hard to guess why the British might have wanted to preserve this myth, but we're still hard-pressed to explain the acceptance and perdurance in India of other forms of this mythology of liberating foreign horsemen, which is unlikely to have been subjected to British mediation. The history of the mythology of horses in India demonstrates the ways in which the people of India first identified the horses with people who ruled them on horseback, and then identified themselves with the horses, in effect positioning themselves as their own exploiters. Like all great symbols, horses are often susceptible not only of inversion, the horse of the conquerors becomes the horse of the conquered, but also of subversion, in which the values of the conquerors are first assimilated and then reversed by those who are conquered. This is subversion, however, turned on its head, as it were, subversion inverted, subversion from the bottom up. And this is not all that's happening. The myth of horses was, like the horses, a gift from the sea or from the sky, from another world that was generous, even if only accidentally and ambivalently generous, divine as well as demonic. Where horses gave the nobles power, horse myths gave the villagers another kind of nobility, if only through glimpses of the glamour of the dominant classes, such as the Rajputs, or the political power of the conquerors, such as the Mughals or the British. The association of horses with Indian kings contributed to the continuing popular identification of horses with power and the gods as symbols of royalty and grandeur. The villagers may be worshiping horses in order to gain some of that power for themselves. This is an otherness not loathed, but admired, not despised, but coveted. It is an otherness that has been assimilated into the native system of values. This yoke, at least the villagers, like good horses, willingly accepted. In India, in conclusion, where most people don't have horses, horses may well take on their shadow persona as an unfulfilled wish, as the symbol of what one doesn't have, of what is possessed by someone else. This lends horses, over and above their natural allure, all the glamour and pathos of the interior room watched by the child outside, pressing her nose against the window pane. This is an exoticism that has been assimilated into the native system of values as a complex source of ambivalent meaning. The Indian mythology of horses is a testament to the vitality of the imagination and to the human drive to go on and on responding merely to the memory or to the view from afar of a charismatic animal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Doniger. And I was really enjoying the session. And I think I got so much to learn and so much to look forward in the book that you are going to be releasing soon, hopefully. And there are many questions for you in the chat, and I'll read those out for you. This question is by Srinivas Vittal, and his question is, can you throw some light on the Portuguese control on horse trade in India?
The Portuguese were very important. A great deal of the horse trade came through Goa and through other Western and South Indian ports. So they had a big piece of it. But it was never all the South Indian ports. There was always overland trade, and there was also shipping from farther, from Central Asia and around the point. So it was a big piece of it. It was fairly late. I mean, horses came to India from Greece much earlier than the Portuguese presence in Goa. So, but when they got there, they were indeed important. And they also largely imported Arabian horses rather than horses from Portugal. They took their horses from closer to India. First of all, Portugal's a long way away. The British tried bringing horses in from Britain, but it's a long way. And it was much easier to get them from New South Wales. They got some of them from South Africa also. So the Portuguese did indeed have a great industry, but they weren't usually Portuguese horses.
The next question is by Reena Sen. Her question is, what about the horses brought to India by Central Asian migrants during the Vedic age?
Well, those were the first horses. Well, that's not true. There were horses, there were archaeological remains of horses from a very early period in India. And even of the domestication of horses, something that might have been a bit, which is what you need to ride a horse, in some of the archaeology. There are no horses in the Indus Valley. There are no remains of horses or horse bits. So the first horses that were domesticated and used in an active way, not the first horses that existed but the first horses that were really used in India were precisely the ones that were ridden into India from the people that we call the Indo-European speakers, who came probably from someplace in Central Asia. So that's where the first cult of the horse comes, and it's central to Vedic stuff. It's not just an accident. The whole of Vedic religion in many ways centers around the horses. So those were the first most important wave of horsemen. And those are the people that love the stallions. There's all that martial male stuff in the Vedas about stallions. So to have the Arabs bringing in mares was a real change in the culture of the horse. I mean, they obviously had mares. You can't have horses if you don't have mares. But the ones that one preferred and wrote about and wrote the poetry about were the stallions.
Yeah. The next question is by Dr. Sukhdev Sohal. His question is, how long did women have right to ride horse in war and social functions? You being a horsewoman yourself.
Indeed. I never rode a horse in war, though. Certainly, the Delhi Sultanate, we have paintings and evidence of women riding horses, famous women. There are stories of women who jumped off the tops of forts riding horses, and there are a lot of Mughal women as well. There are not women riding horses depicted in Sanskrit literature that I can think of offhand. There is the mythology of the mare that I've written a lot about, Saranyu, the woman who becomes a horse. But women are not associated with horses in the old classical Hindu texts. So it comes in later. I think it comes in with Arabic and Mughal culture. And then women did ride. Absolutely did. Were important as riders.
The next question is by Ruchika Sharma. Her question is, Dr. Doniger, what happens to the elephants when the horses became the royal right? Are there any myths about the elephants and the horse, considering elephants were the royal right before the horse came in with the Turks?
There certainly is a great deal of mythology about the elephants. Simon Digby wrote the great book years ago, War Horse and Elephant Under the Delhi Sultanate, which I depend a lot. So elephants are very important in war, but they're less mobile than horses. And they played a different role, which I really haven't gone into in this book. There's also another book by Thomas, a new book about horses, about elephants. I'll think of his name, Tom Hopkins. No, not the Thomas. Anyway, they weren't as mobile, and therefore they weren't as useful in many ways. They carried things, and they were great tanks. And we have the stories I mentioned about the horse going up against the elephant and drumming his hooves on the elephant's tusk. As symbols of royalty, elephants and horses were both very important in royal symbolism. Elephants, of course, were even more, horses were expensive, but elephants were even more expensive than horses. So they're true parallel rather than conflicting mythologies. Horses, kings use them both in their symbolism, and they use them both for real in battle, but they have different mythologies. And the mythology of elephants is not as vividly human as it is of the horses, and there's not as much of it that I know of anyway. Horses come into all of the Sanskrit texts all the time, and elephants are more stately and more symbolic, and are less involved in the kind of human interactions that the Rajput epics deal with. So it's a parallel and very important mythology, but different from horses.
This question is by Sagnik Sarkar. Did the ancient Indo-Raymond trade have any influence in the influx of horses into India?
Did the ancient Indian what trade?
Indo-Roman trade.
Indo-Roman trade. Yes, horses came from Greece and Rome also. I mean, the trade routes were open, really. Well, they were open at the time of the Indus Valley already. There were trade routes. There was a lot of trade. The idea that India is sort of stuck there, hidden by the Himalayas, is really wrong. So yes, the Greeks and Romans were also involved in horse trading. They also came over the Northwest passes. Alexander the Great came into India that way on horseback. There are pictures in the north from the Northwest of Greeks riding horses into India and riding Greek horses. So yes, the brief Greek invasion, which failed, but brought a lot of Greek culture into India. There were indeed a lot of trade with Greek and Rome from a very early period, and with other civilizations even during the Indus period. Continued. There weren't horses in the Indus period, but the horse trade began in the Vedic period.
This question is by Biju Joseph. Why rulers of India didn't show any interest in Mongolian horse trade, considering the fact that they were better breed in warfare?
Well, is it the case that they didn't? I mean, there were Mongolian horses. Sure, there were. The horses came from Central Asia, and that also came from Mongolia. I don't know what he means. There was important Mongolian horse trade, sure.
Yeah. So this question is by Professor Sushandra Ghosh from University of Hyderabad. Her question is, horses used to come from Fargana as far as early Chinese text narrates, and they were known as blood-sweating horses. Can we think that the horses of the Vedic corpus could have come from the same region around Fargana, though the time period is vast?
Yes, the answer is yes. the answer is we really do not know where the horses came in the Vedic period, and we don't know where the people came in the very Vedic period. All we know is what language they spoke. And the distribution of Indo-European languages suggests, as well as the distribution of horse materials, the famous spoke-wheeled chariot and bits and so forth, suggests an origin someplace in the Caucasus, but it has by no means been established. I think we've all gotten out of the idea of the Indo-European speaking people's invasions. Whatever happened, they came in gradually, probably as traders. There's some martial tone to some of the Veda, but it's not what it's all about. So yes, anywhere in a number of regions from the Caucasus south and maybe even north, we really don't know the origin of the Indo-European. The Caucasus seems to be the best guess that most people who know more about it than I do say, based both on the horse is the key to a lot of the argument, and horse remains, and in particular, the remains of domestication of horses. Remember, there were horses. The idea, for instance, that when the Spaniards came to New World, they brought horses with them that astonished the Native Americans. Well, there already were horses in the New World when the Spanish got there, but they weren't used the way the Spanish used them. So too, there were horses in India, but they weren't used the way the Indo-European speakers used them. So it's really a combination of linguistic and scattered archaeological equine evidence. But we really do not know exactly where they came from. There's several good hypotheses besides the Caucasus.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering all the questions. We have one observation by Sagnik, I think, and I'll read that out. As to women in battle, Aisha famously led an army into battle on camel back, as did Noor Jahan led an attack on elephant back to rescue Jahangir. But interesting to note that no mention of horse riding warriors in Sanskrit texts, as you mentioned. Probably
No
horse riding,
no horse riding women warriors, she's saying, right?
yeah, horse riding warrior, women warriors, yeah.
Women warriors, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably horse riding was a symbol of patriarchal martial sovereignty for the king, which was politically, socially inexpedient to be associated with women in official texts. So this is his observation. Thank you so much, ma'am. We really enjoyed the session, and I think we now look forward to the book launch on Karwaan very soon.
We'll do the best we can. Thank you for your good questions and for your invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.